Putin should take no heart from that, because I think once the new factories manufacturing 155 ammunition are up at full speed, that is a guaranteed steady supply of heavy artillery ammunition for the Ukrainians. Once all these drone factories are up and running, that's a guaranteed supply of drones for the Ukrainians. So the Western industrial base is mobilizing, and that will take some time. We just need to make sure that we're very clear in our political intent in the meantime, so that Putin doesn't think the game's up.
And in the meantime, you could, for example, change the permissions on the use of Western supplied weapons. President Zelensky is demanding that further relaxation of those restrictions on targeting Russia. Points to 800 glide bombs in a single week. Should Ukraine be allowed to target the aerodromes inside Russia with long-range missiles to stop the aircraft that carry those glide bombs that are causing so much damage in Ukraine?
So in my view, yes. But I said that, early doors when we'd first given MLRS, the rocket artillery that had a sort of range of 150 kilometers or so. I was asked when I was somewhere in Eastern Europe whether or not those could be used to target the targets inside Russia, and I said, of course they can. I mean, I think providing they're legitimate military targets that are being engaged to disrupt the Russian logistics and command and control networks that are supporting the front line, then of course they should be engaged. Now, I was gently told that I was probably writing checks that my level of ministerial office had no authority to write. But I think we've moved a long way since then. And what you see is that the Russians aren't fools. Okay, every time that there has been an evolution in Ukrainian capability through the latest round of gifting, the Russians have revised where they site their headquarters. They've revised where they site their logistics nodes. Now that makes the Russian army quite brittle, because they've got extended lines of communication between their rear echelons and their forward fighting echelons. But the fact is that we could, if we gave the Ukrainians the permissions they seek, push that Russian command and control and those Russian logistic nodes even further rearwards, and in the process make their supply lines even more brittle still.
I suppose that the fear might be that Ukraine may be tempted, rather than just preventing immediate threat of Russian advances, to actually harm Putin and Putin's Russia itself.
Yeah, and I think that and therein sits exactly the dilemma that people like Jake Sullivan, Tim Barrow would find themselves in if you were to be a fly on the wall in their offices when these sorts of issues are discussed. There is no doubt that militarily, the more that you can stretch Russia's logistics, their supply lines, their command and control networks, the more militarily advantageous that is. But there is also this reality that you've got to balance that against what if the Ukrainians then targeted beyond that. They went for something that had more political impact rather than military impact. What would be the consequence of that in terms of the way that Russia would respond to a perceived Western involvement? Now, goes back to the earlier conversation about escalation dominance. Even if we have nothing to do with it, even if nothing happens, the Russians will always say that the West is doing this, the West is malevolent, the West is trying to defeat Russia, and this is sort of some sort of Western imperialism. So that narrative is always going to come from the Russians, and we have to therefore make sure that we're not deterred by the rhetoric that they were always going to use. But, easy for people like me that are, former ministers, former soldiers, now in the commentariat, to say, of course we should. National security advisors, when advising their prime ministers and presidents, have to have regard for a wider set of consequences.
We just had the second anniversary of Operation Interflex, the training of Ukrainian troops in the UK. What could, in your view, a full-on Western training mission inside Ukraine achieve that can't be done from outside the country?
Formation level training. I just think I think that we can, around Europe, easily do individual battlefield casualty replacements. Too easy. We've been doing it enormously successful through Interflex for the last 2 years.
And how much of a difference could that make?
Well, I mean, I think it's made an enormous difference. I mean, given the evidence is that the troops that have enjoyed the training provided by the UK or our partners all around Europe and America has been obviously training people in Europe too. So too allies from farther afield who have New Zealand, Australia, Canada, who have sent trainers to be part of it too. Those troops have arrived at the front line with a better chance of surviving and a better chance of succeeding, but they've been trained as individuals. The battle group or the company group and battle group level training, as limited as it has been, is broadly successful. But it's been mostly around integrating new Western NATO standard equipment into the Ukrainian force. But what we've not done yet, and there's a sort of practical reason for this, is we've not trained at brigade and divisional level. And that's just simply the logistics of bringing an entire Ukrainian brigade out of the line and sending it 1,000 miles rearwards. Stand fast whether Romania, Poland, Germany, or anybody else would want to host that scale of Ukrainian training in their country. It's be an incredible target for the Russians. So I just think that if we're to complete this journey, and I do think people have to have in their minds the journey that the Allies went on between 1940 and 1944, the kind of, between the retreat from continental Europe at Dunkirk through to the Normandy landings. It takes a really long time and an incredible amount of effort to turn a volunteer second echelon force into a professional army capable of doing an invasion or a re-invasion. So the Western mission, as brilliant as Interflex has been, has to now transform into a focus on generating brigade and divisional level maneuver and how that is coordinated with air support, precision fires, so artillery and missile strikes, so that it is an overwhelming synchronized effect, exactly as NATO would fight. But to do that, probably that's going to require a Western training mission in Western Ukraine.
Generating manpower is also a huge problem at the moment. I'm just wondering what you're, speaking as a former soldier, interested in your perspective about the news that's being reported of the recruitment of convicts from prisons by Ukraine.
Well, needs must, right? I mean, I mean, I'll say that I was as critical. I'll be as critical of that as in principle as I was of the Russians. But I do think that when you're fighting for the very existence of your nation, you make decisions that probably sit uneasily with liberal centrists like me, but are what is necessary to keep fighting. I also think that it's not quite the question you're asking, but Zelensky has been racked over the decision about how far into his population to extend mobilization. And I think that, there ultimately is no other option. And I appreciate that this is incredibly difficult for the Ukrainian nation, who don't want to sacrifice its youth, its future, in order that they are there to rebuild the country when the time comes. But barely 6 months ago, the average age on the front lines for the Ukrainian armed forces was about my age, kind of early 40s. And that's not sustainable. If you're fighting for your very existence as a nation, you do need to mobilize everybody. Now, prisoners sits ill with someone like me, but needs must. But I think that mobilization needs to extend further, and increasingly younger Ukrainian men and women need to be called upon.
The NATO summit is fast approaching in Washington, 75th anniversary of NATO. What do you think it can do as an alliance to be more assertive, to stand up to Russia?
Speak with one voice whilst offering something very bold to the Ukrainians. But I am incredibly aware that might be contradictory. And that was kind of what was flushed out at Vilnius. I would suggest that, the part of the alliance, the sort of Eastern and Northern European part of the alliance that wanted to be stronger in an offer to Ukraine, push that so hard that it meant that the summit appeared to not have unanimity in its view, and arguably strategically, that was more damaging than the strength of the offer was made to that was made to Ukraine. So I suspect that the sort of Sherpas, the sort of officials that will have been running backwards and forwards between their capitals and Washington over the last few weeks, preparing the ground for the summit, will have been torn between the necessity of a summit that showed complete agreement and unanimous agreement around the future of NATO, bearing in mind that the audience for that is not just Putin, but the Republican National Convention that follows a week later, versus the need for the conference to have some teeth in its offer to Ukraine. If you ask me to put some money on, I'm afraid I think that what we might see is a relatively timid summit statement, but one that prioritizes, the sort of the consensus of the alliance, so that there's no weakness in the alliance shown to either Putin or Trump in the run up to their convention, or Putin watching on from afar, thinking that NATO risks fracture.
And there's obviously not likely to be any offer to join NATO to Ukraine. And President Zelensky, following this conference, Zelensky says, though, that if that fails to happen as expected, that its physical security must be offered by NATO, and it's asking for all the weapons it needs. It's asking for Patriot anti-missile systems, substantial number of F-16s, the opportunity to use those weapons inside Russia. I mean, are NATO allies doing enough there?
So my view is that the NATO offer to Ukraine should come now. If I was still in government, that's what I would be advocating pretty forcefully. And that would have required an incredible amount of diplomatic work, and I think in Berlin and even in Washington, that would have not been a particularly easy argument to make. But the way I see it is that there are only three outcomes to the war in Ukraine broadly. One is that Russia wins, complete Russian success, lots more territory taken. Well, the consequence of that is that NATO has to rapidly rearm and take a position on the border of what was Ukraine, anticipating that a victorious, emboldened Putin would be ready to take another bite out of NATO territory shortly thereafter. So that's outcome number one, requires the alliance to be even stronger. Outcome number two is that this stalemate endures. Either Trump negotiates something that requires that demands territorial compromise, or it all peters out in stalemate. But if that happens, NATO definitely ends up guaranteeing the security of the rump of Ukraine. Whatever. I mean, by default, that's what ends up happening. Or Ukraine is utterly successful, drives the Russians out, and peace and harmony breaks out forevermore. In which case, brilliant. But those first two options are the more likely, probably the stalemate the most likely of them all. And NATO ends up being pivotal to what comes next. So I don't see why, if that's where we know this ends up landing in all probability, why we don't make the offer to Ukraine sooner. And that brings with it, if you on the conference circuit, people love to kind of talk about, what's the theory of victory, or absent that, what is the theory of defeat for Putin? Well, if Putin's initial strategic aim was to go to war, to invade Ukraine, to deny Ukraine to NATO, an utter fallacy, but that was his strategic aim, then saying to him NATO is going to be in the rump of Ukraine whether you like it or not because we'll guarantee the security of whatever Ukraine is post this war. That's his strategic defeat, alongside Finland and Sweden ceding to the alliance. Utter catastrophe at the strategic level, utter catastrophe for Putin. And so my view is that that the offer should be made now at Washington. What an amazing thing for the 75th anniversary summit to achieve, but I don't think it will.